Welcome back, Capital F football fans, to the O&O Sports YouTube channel. Today, I am bringing you what I believe to be some of the most underrated programs going into next season. Now, what do I mean by that? Basically, these are going to be a few teams that I think will surpass what I project to be their preseason win total expectations. These could be teams that underperformed last year. These could be teams that did pretty well last year, but lost a lot of guys in the transfer portal. Basically, just teams that I think are being undervalued, underrated going into the 2026 season. Now, before we get into it, a couple things I need to explain. If you already know what SVE and good rating are, you can go ahead and skip towards the video. But for those who don't know, I created two new metrics that I think are the cutting edge of measuring success in college football. Those being success versus expectation, aka SVE, and good rating. You will see these graphs on the right hand of your screen somewhere over here throughout this video. Those are what those represent. And if you're interested on learning more about these metrics, I wrote an article about it. It will be linked in the description. Go ahead and check it out. And without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the first team of this video, which just so happens to be the South Carolina Gamecocks. This one is very contentious for me, especially because last year, South Carolina fans, you fell on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of how I thought you were rated going into the 2025 season. I did not think South Carolina was going to be a good team at all. And wouldn't you know it, I was right last year. Unfortunately for Gamecock fans, I was right. But rejoice, this year I am on your side. One, because it's an even year. It seems like the Gamecocks and Shane Beamer are always better in an even year. It's been the trend for the Gamecocks so far in Shane Beamer's tenure. And on top of that, Shane Beamer retains and adds a ton of talent, especially most notably at offensive line, which was a struggle last year. They added 36 Power 4 starts across the offensive line, most notably NC State offensive tackle Jacarius Peak, who was a top 10 player according to On3 in the transfer portal overall. They also add a ton of depth at the skill positions, including guys like Nitro Tuggle, Christian Clark, formerly of Texas, guys that I think will strengthen the skill positions, which once again was a struggle for South Carolina last year, was very underdeveloped and very inexperienced at the skill positions last year. And once again, I think their defense will be legit this year. That has been consistent over the past 2 or 3 seasons for the Gamecocks, especially retaining once again a guy like Dylan Stewart, who we saw take a step back last year without having that dynamic edge rusher on the opposite side helping him, but who I think is still one of the best players overall in the sport, as well as Lenoris Sellers at quarterback. And for Lenoris Sellers, the biggest acquisition in my opinion is getting Kendall Briles from TCU. I'm not super high on Kendall Briles, but I do believe it is a major step up from Mike Shula last year. I think he will be in the range of Dowell Loggins a couple years ago as an offensive coordinator. And as you can see on the right hand side of your screen, their SVE and good rating graphs don't really inspire much, but overall South Carolina and Shane Beamer have been a streaky team. They're not going to sustain a super high level of success any given year, so that's not super worrying in my opinion. They do have a tough schedule once again this year, being in the SEC. That is natural, but in my opinion they do have pretty favorable spacing. 4 home games in October and November. They get Tennessee at home in October, coming off a bye, which I think gives them a massive advantage in that matchup. I expect their preseason win total to be something around 5 or 6 wins in the preseason just because of last year's performance, and I expect them to add at least 1 to 3 wins on those expectations next year. And after them, we have none other than the Nebraska Cornhuskers. Once again, a dark horse sleeper, whatever you want to say about them. We're bringing out all the old classics so far with South Carolina and Nebraska as our first 2 underrated teams of this video, but in my opinion there are a ton of interesting narrative dynamics about this football team going into 2026. Obviously last year they expected the year 3 Matt Rule jump. It did not end up coming to fruition, and then they lose Dylan Raiola along with their upside as an offense that Raiola brings to the table. They replace him with Anthony Calandria through the transfer portal, which in my opinion raises their floor as an offense, but I will get more into that in a second. They replace John Butler at defensive coordinator with Rob Arick from San Diego State. They replace their offensive line coach and Donovan Raiola, Uncle removal of Dylan Raiola with Georgia Tech offensive line coach Jeep Wade. And overall last season, they were a very young, very undersized team, especially at defensive line. And what inspires me about this team going into next season is they're 11th in the country in returning snaps overall, and they retain 76% of their production on defense. Those stats coming from puntandrally.com. Be sure to check that out in the description below. And on top of those returning production metrics, they restructure their offensive line. They add playmakers on both sides of the football. And like I was alluding to a second ago, the biggest thing for this team, in my opinion, is that restructured offensive line as well as Anthony Calandria. I think those additions, as well as adding Jeep Wade as offensive line coach, signal an identity shift on offense. Last year, it was kind of just a Dylan Raiola show. Let him go out, do whatever he feels like. And of course, they had Emmett Johnson, who was an NFL caliber running back. No true identity, which has plagued this team for the past few years. I think they shift to that pro spread offense with Calandria, get the quarterback run game involved with the natural run game, as well as the run blocking scheming. I think that raises their floor, which I think they should have been doing from the get-go, while also lowering their ceiling, of course, losing a 5-star quarterback like Dylan Raiola. But when you pair that with schedule and expectation, I think it makes for a pretty interesting dynamic in terms of preseason win total projection. You're coming off of what was seen as a letdown season in 2025. You get Oregon, Illinois, and Iowa on the road. You get Indiana, Ohio State, and Washington at home. So I think naturally with that, their preseason win total ends up drifting to about the 5.5 to 6.5 win total range. And I think with a new identity on offense, getting bigger on the defensive line, getting a more experienced defensive coordinator, I think they can easily add 1 or 2 wins to that preseason win total. And after them, we have the Calgorithm, the California Golden Bears. This is one of 2 cheats technically that I'm using in this video because they fired their head coach, bring in a new guy, so the expectations of old don't really apply to this year's team. Of course, Tosh Lupoy comes in, the former Oregon defensive coordinator. He retains a ton of the roster, which was a pretty big surprise for losing your head coach. Most importantly of those retentions, he retains, and I'm going to try this, Jaron Kiwi Sagapulatele. I hope that's right. I'm sorry, JKS. I'm just going to refer to you as that from now on if you're watching this video. But on top of that, they bring in pieces on both sides of the lines, both offensively and defensively. They bring in a top 25 transfer portal class, at a modest 8 power 4 starts on offensive line, 3 elite skill position pieces to help JKS, which is very, very important for this guy, who just as a true freshman was one of the better quarterbacks in the ACC overall last year. They bring in Rutgers wide receiver Ian Strong, Ohio wide receiver Chase Hendricks, and New Mexico tight end Dorian Thomas. All 3 guys that will help space out the field for JKS. I think that could do dividends for his raw production stats next year. And most importantly for this team, I think Tosh Lupoy will bring in his defensive identity, his scheme, his philosophy, which will do wonders for that defense in 2026. And in their last 3 seasons under Justin Wilcox, they won 6 games in all 3 of those years, which I think will have their preseason win total in 2026 at around 5.5 to 6.5 once again. And I am very, very high on this team going into next season. I think they could add 2 or 3 wins to that very, very easily with Lupoy at head coach now. And after them, we have the UCF Central Florida Knights, and virtually nobody is high on this team going into 2026 from what I've seen. I wasn't very high on them going into 2025. I think they did outperform expectation though in that season. Plus, they were a very, very injury-riddled team in 2025. So to win 5 games with a pretty tough, pretty decent Big 12 schedule is a lot better than I expected in all honesty. But this year, they returned 71% of their snaps, albeit with not a great roster from last year, but they do add 8,300 portal snaps, most notably Alonzo Barnett from James Madison last year. In the past 2 seasons at James Madison, 6,500 total yards, 61 touchdowns. And in my opinion, this is the perfect guy to run Frost's offense for next season. He reminds me a lot of Adrian Martinez, formerly of Nebraska. Hopefully won't be as turnover prone as that guy, but definitely a step up from what they had at quarterback last year. And even if they didn't improve that much from a pure talent perspective, I think with them playing in the Big 12, not playing a ton of elite defenses, will put them in a better spot than most teams going into next season. They do play a pretty tough schedule in the Big 12. At home, they have TCU, BYU, and Arizona State. On the road, they have Pitt in the out of conference, Houston, and Oklahoma State. Not awful, but not favorable really either. But what's most interesting to me about their schedule is their November slate is especially lenient. They go to Kansas versus Arizona State, versus Iowa State, who is in a complete rebuild after losing one of their best coaches ever in Matt Campbell, and then at Colorado, who is pretty wishy-washy, not quite sure what they're going to look like next year. I think their preseason win total will be low once again next year just because there's not a ton of hype around Scott Frost anymore. They didn't perform super well last year, so I think their preseason win total falls in the 4.5 to 6.5 win range. And if this offense can be as effective as I think it will be, I think they could easily add 2 or 3 wins to that preseason win total. And last but certainly not least, it is the Florida Gators. I am very, very bullish on Florida going into year 1 with John Sumrall because, and I recognize that this is going to sound pretty biased, he is one of my favorite coaches. I think it is probably a top 3 to top 5 hire overall in this coaching carousel cycle. And I think who they got at offensive coordinator is also in that range for coordinator hires. It is Buster Faulkner, formerly of Georgia Tech. And the biggest thing for John Sumrall is how he adjusts to the SEC. We saw Sumrall go from the Sun Belt to the American Conference, have relatively no issues, and be at the top of that conference. I don't think they end up being conference contenders like he was at Tulane, but I think Florida very well could be in the top half of the SEC next year, most notably because they return 80% of their snaps, 72% on offense, 90% on defense, which is the biggest thing for this team in my opinion. I think that is indicative of how confident this staff is in this roster and vice versa in all honesty. They know exactly how talented they are. They've just been underutilized to this point with Billy Napier previously, and they add 7,800 snaps through the portal. A lot of guys following Buster Faulkner from Georgia Tech to Florida, which will make the transition a lot easier on offense. They add a ton of size and experience on both fronts. They get elite talent in the secondary and at the skill positions, and it's just an all-around solid class. And similar to Nebraska, I think the move with Buster Faulkner, with the quarterback they got in Aaron Philo to run the Buster Faulkner offense, I think that raises the floor of this offense, whereas before they were kind of just hoping their 5-star quarterback would be able to throw to their 5-star wide receivers and have no issue. And we've seen it seemingly throughout all of college football history. You can have all the 5 stars you want, but if you don't have a clear identity, you're aimless. You're in no man's land. So I think Coach Faulkner comes in, installs his pro spread offense, which is one of the most elite pro spread offenses in all of college football the past few seasons. They bring in some of that Georgia Tech development, so they're not starting from ground zero. And I think that raises their floor to about 5 or 6 wins in all honesty. And with that talent level that they naturally have at Florida, I think they're capable of more than a few upsets. They were 12th in terms of roster talent in the sport, according to 24/7 Sports last year. And that doesn't just go away now that Billy Napier is no longer the coach. I think they are a very, very dangerous team going into next season. If I'm Alabama, if I'm Texas, I don't want to see them on my schedule. And with that SEC schedule, with it being year 1 with a new coach, a lot of uncertainty surrounding that program right now, I think that preseason win total falls around 5.5 to 6.5 wins. And I am of the opinion that they could add 2 or 3 wins to that immediately in year 1 under John Sumrall. And I'm starting to see a theme here. If you can add identity on offense and you can add size up front, you're going to be in a good position to exceed expectations. So I hope to see that as the theme for all of these teams next year. And with that, thank you for watching. As always, be sure to like and subscribe if you did enjoy it. Be sure to tune in next week where I go over the most overrated teams in college football. That one will be spicy. Once again, thank you for watching, and I will see you then.